There are four kinds of economies in the world: developed countries, underdeveloped countries, Japan, and Argentina. Japan is a country that is more unique than most. Its economy has been completely stagnant for decades. Millions of people saw no raises for 30 years, millions more couldn't find a job, and many deemed these the lost decades. Administration after administration would try to change this, pumping trillions upon trillions of yen into the economy to get it growing again. Now it seems Japan is finally on the path to growth. It has become a more normalized economy, yet Japan is dealing with new issues it hasn't had to deal with in decades: inflation, aging population, and a more aggressive neighbor across the East China Sea. Now Japan has decidedly picked a new leader to guide them through this era of turbulence. Sanae Takaichi, the Iron Lady. She has made promises to lead Japan into the unknown, changing the status quo that has ruled Japan for 81 years. Along with this change will come fundamental changes in how Japan operates and sees the world. And today we'll focus on how Sanae Takaichi will be able to save Japan from another lost decade. Hi, I'm Jeff, the host of Casualities, and today we'll be talking about this topic that has really flung under the radar in most circles. And that is how Takaichi is changing Japan and the new role they want to play in the new world order. A country defined by pacifism, hard work, and high-quality industries like Japan is seeing those standards being given a reality check to see if that's what Japan really wants. Takaichi is deciding to be a maverick in a position where her simply being a woman in that position was a monumental accomplishment in and of itself. She wants to rearm Japan and start selling weapons abroad. She wants to keep Japan Japanese, killing the idea of Japan opening up to mass migration, putting Japan's traditional heavy industry, some of the largest corporations in the world, in a precarious situation. Sanae Takaichi has been given the keys to the kingdom to reshape Japan. However, before we get into those changes, we need to see why she has been trusted with so much, where Japan and its ruling LDP party have been for the last 40 years, and how she'll be able to wrestle control of the party and unify all the factions into one. And for that, we have to go way back to the 1980s. The lost decades. We need to rewind back to September 22nd, 1985, when the Plaza Accord is signed, setting plans into place to depreciate the dollar against the yen. See, Japan was a manufacturing powerhouse. Most of these products would be exported and shipped around the world. Japan would become incredibly wealthy. With its explosive economic growth came exponential growth in the value of everything in Japan. In fact, the Imperial Palace was estimated to be nearly twice as valuable than all the real estate in California. While this was happening, Japan would try to keep the value of the yen lower so they could continue to export to the United States. The US didn't like how its trade deficit was running wild with Japan. So Ronald Reagan approached Japan with a plan to reduce the value of the dollar while maintaining Japanese exports to the United States. Thus enters the Plaza Accords. And more specific to our topic today, the carry trade system was born. The yen carry trade is essentially a system where you can borrow yen, a currency in a low interest rate environment, convert it to dollars, which had a higher interest rate environment, thus letting businesses have access to high-yield savings in US dollars while the yen was kept at extremely low interest rates. This helps increase demand for the dollar and decrease demand for the yen, making it possible for future cheap exports to America. However, this would cause a large bubble to pop in Japan. The stock market crashed in 1990, and a recession would drive down the value of everything in Japan. By 1992, the value of the Imperial Palace couldn't even match the value of a street in San Francisco's Tenderloin neighborhood, considered one of the most run-down and unkept neighborhoods in all of San Francisco. Most normal economies would have a large number of layoffs, and new companies would emerge from large inefficient companies failing. However, most companies in Japan decided not to give wage increases and stopped hiring, showing loyalty to their current employees, but the standard of living would take a hit. To fix this, the Japanese government would spend the next 30 years trying to get inflation up so value and wealth could grow, so people would continue to invest in the economy and get productivity back on track, increasing the standard of living for everyone in Japan. However, because of things like the carry trade, Japan would see no real growth for nearly 30 years. Actual wages and wealth would steadily decline. The government tried to pump stimulus into the system, but nothing worked. Culturally, Japanese citizens are some of the biggest savers in the world. Combine this with the carry trade, and many would rather save and seek higher rates in the United States instead of at home, making investment domestically dry up, and standard solutions just would not work. And as someone who works in finance, this is just a common issue that Japan saw coming, but they just didn't do anything about, to be completely honest. Finally, in 2023, things would change, with global inflation on the rise and legal reforms encouraging corporations to not hoard cash, instead trying to get them to invest it. This led to sustained economic growth and actual investment being pushed into the market. Unions would be able to arrange for the largest wage increases in nearly 40 years, giving life to Japan's economic engine. Because of this, the Japanese central bank would start raising rates. Add in the recent volatility of American politics, the carry trade also began to unwind, thus making it less possible to be able to borrow US dollars, giving the yen a chance to properly meet its market rate. Still, this current economic environment increased prices dramatically as well. Inflation in the last 5 years in Japan nearly reached the same levels of the wage increases, as well as the huge debt that Japan created with years of stimulus has made many worry that Japan will struggle to pay its interest on its debts. Higher borrowing costs and increased labor prices have made many of the keiretsu lose money. In search for cheaper alternatives, they began pushing for more immigration and subsidies to keep all their employees safe from layoffs. This is the environment that Takaichi will inherit. Before she could even make any significant reform, Takaichi had to take control of a party that was floundering. The LDP has been the dominant party in Japan since the end of the US occupation in 1955. The LDP have had a majority in Japan for 65 of the last 71 years, having won the majority back most recently in 2012. After the resignation and sudden assassination of the immensely popular Shinzo Abe, the party has struggled to find a leader that different factions within the party could coalesce behind. First was Fumio Kishida, who had resigned after a slush fund scandal came to light, revealing that Kishida had stored 100 million yen from election campaign finance funding and spent it on personal expenses. They would start a sharp decline in polling. Kishida's replacement, Shiragu Ishiba, would take control and introduce massive spending to help those struggling with inflation. Unfortunately, these measures themselves didn't slow inflation, and his administration would get embroiled in a gift certificate scandal, giving 100,000 yen gift certificates with the aim of helping them buy new suits for Ishiba's staff. He would go on to lose the LDP's majority in the House of Councillors, the upper house of parliament, and this is just complete embarrassment for the LDP, who had had huge majorities in that house for decades. After Ishiba's resignation, another party leadership battle began. Sanae Takaichi was the clear favorite after nearly beating out the previous two prime ministers. After long discussions with Ishiba's reformist faction and Motegi's more hawkish faction, she was able to get full support from Taro Aso, one of the more conservative parts of the LDP party, who holds a lot of sway amongst conservatives, which greenlit the other two factions to fall in line and support her for their premiership. She would immediately step in and remove the faction system from the party and unite them behind her. Watching all of this was the Komeito Party, a party that was in a coalition with the LDP for the last 25 years. They would break off and join the LDP's direct rivals, the Constitutional Democrat Party, forming a new coalition called the Centrist Reform Coalition. This new alliance removed the LDP from the majority in the House of Councillors, the upper house. It was strongly believed by many that the same would happen in the 2026 general election, that the LDP was doomed to fall behind for the third time in modern history. However, this is not the case. When the results came in on February 8th, a very different story was told by the people of Japan. The LDP won 49.9% of the votes for representatives and 36.72% of the votes for overall party voting, netting them 316 seats in the parliament. The LDP actually won 330 seats, but didn't run enough candidates to actually fill out all the proportional tier of candidates, which they should have, but they didn't, and they could have had more seats. But this would still put them over the 2/3 majority needed to be able to amend the Constitution. They would also ally themselves with the Inshin Party, which won 36 seats, giving them almost 75% control of the parliament. This is the largest victory in modern Japanese history. She would win the approval of roughly 60% of all retirees, 80% of almost all older generations, and amongst young voters, she would have 92.4% of all young voters. That's right, she has genuine support of young people that many dictators claim to have. Many leaders have literally killed to get this kind of support. In an autocracy, most would say that these numbers are impossible. But how did she do it? What did she do? Well, she was able to use communication to its fullest extent. She launched a social media campaign that got not only her ideas, but the way she shows her life directly to the Japanese people. They could see her as a person. They saw her interactions with other political leaders that made her trustworthy. She has fun, like playing drums in a rock concert with the president of South Korea. Many felt like she was a breath of fresh air, openly communicating to the people. And when she did communicate, she wasn't as bashful as many are in Japanese public eye. She was very direct, to the point, and sounded confident, something hard to find in the land of the rising sun's politics. To many, she was a fresh, new figure above politics and can be viewed as a wife and a mother that cares about her family and loves what she does. Add in the fact that she had many popular stances that resonated with the masses, it just became impossible to not see her win. However, as always, the truth is still a little bit more mixed. Her entire career has revolved around politics. She worked in the U.S. for Congresswoman Patricia Schroeder, came back to Japan, and has been in the parliament for over 30 years. When Shinzo Abe came to power, she was given important positions within the administration that showed her skills at being a strong and competent leader. She has some of the deepest connections within the conservative side of the party. Many would say that she is deeply tied to the international media moguls and isn't scared to flex her relationship to intimidate opponents. She has been involved in many backroom meetings, especially those related to safety and regulation, setting the playing field for many corporate entities behind closed doors, taking many stances that people would call pragmatic and not at all in line with many of the populist ideas the people like. She has been a key cog in the government machine, but Takaichi was able to show another side of herself that convinced the people to believe in her. Even counting the scandals that rocked the party, none of it seems to damage her, making her tougher than Teflon. She is the Iron Lady. No one can serve two masters. A wise man once said, no one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you'll be devoted to one and despise the other. Takaichi is a very clever political operator. She respects the culture that she is in, but she wants to chart a new path and has been given a mandate to do so. But that does not mean that she can do whatever she wants at will. Japanese culture is one of the most collective in the world. Even with supermajorities that she has, people will expect consensus amongst the parties, as well as consensus amongst those interests that got her there as well. This can be a very difficult balancing act that she will have to try and deliver. With each major issue, she will have this dilemma attached to it. Can she find a way to serve all those interests that got her elected? Can she answer to the masters of Japan, or will she make them bow to her? When we talk about the issue of China, the answer becomes abundantly clear. Takaichi campaigned hard on remilitarizing Japan and making it a world power again, simply because its neighborhood with North Korea and China has become too unstable and unsafe. Believing any direct attack on Taiwan would be too much for the Japanese to accept. In fact, Takaichi stated in a parliamentary session on November 7, 2025, that a Chinese attack on Taiwan could constitute a survival-threatening situation for Japan. She explained, if warships are used accompanied by the exercise of military force, then however you look at it, it could be a situation posing an existential threat to the country. She wants Japan to embrace rearmament with open arms, giving Japan a fighting chance against China. This is changing the cultural stance for the last 81 years of essentially no military to speak of in Japan. The U.S. Navy protects Japanese land and shipping overseas. The general idea is that Japan would drop its militaristic ways after World War II and never come back. You can see the proof of this in Japanese passports being accepted in practically every country in the world. Japan has developed some amazing drone technology on a small scale, as well as other naval and spying capabilities coveted by the world. However, the industry to mass produce these items isn't there. Weapon exports have long been strictly regulated and limited, making it almost impossible for anyone to do. The Constitution itself puts extreme restrictions on Japan's ability to wage war. Article 9 of the Constitution pretty much bans a military and denounces Japan's right to declare war, allowing only Japan's existence being threatened as the only way to form a temporary military. How is Takaichi approaching this? Well, she has appropriated 9 trillion yen to Japan's defense budget, expanding Japan's retaliatory strike capabilities, building a domestic industrial base to produce rockets, jet fighters, artillery, and drones. She's also convinced the parliament to lift the ban on weapons exports, allowing Japan to export to partner nations it has agreed to sell weapons to. This deal opens Japan up to the opportunity to sell its new anti-drone defense systems to Ukraine, something that Ukraine has been asking for years. It is believed that these reforms have helped Takaichi get well on her way to reach the goal of 2% of GDP defense spending by 2028. You may believe that this violates Article 9 of the Constitution. It sounds completely contradictory to what the Constitution says. However, remember the quote earlier. China invading Taiwan is a survival threatening situation. Many experts believe that this is a way to have the Supreme Court deem it as a constitutional while expanding the military, creating a legal interpretation that will give her more breathing room without actually having to amend the Constitution. These changes will go over very well within her own party. They are something many within the LDP have been calling for years. The LDP establishment can view this as another win for their political base. The companies that make up the donation base of the LDP are set to benefit hugely from this. Nissan, Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, Kaidanren are set to receive huge contracts. These companies have put in nearly 3 billion yen into the LDP coffers. And believe me, most of this is extremely hard to track because these companies use extremely complex processes to donate money. And the way that works is they essentially give money to big business organizations from the company, like unions or federations that represent businesses, who then pass on this money onto associations, essentially read lobbyists. And then these lobbyist associations break down the donations into smaller amounts and send them into what is called the People's Political Association, which is an LDP think tank that then distributes the money to regional LDP branches so certain candidates are able to get more funding than others. And on top of this, that grants are given out to each party and it's done proportionally, so the largest party gets the most money, so on and so forth. The LDP gets a huge amount of money for election campaign. The LDP gets a huge amount of money to run election campaign finances. And you wonder why they have been in power for over 90% of the time in Japanese history. Many of these corporations are the same ones that drive exports and cause the wage and economic stagnation with their hoarding of cash that we talked about earlier. Putting all this together, it is hard to imagine how this cultural paradigm hasn't shifted yet, but it is finally shifting. The youth in Japan in particular are much more open to rearming than previous generations. However, the stigma and controversy that could cause means that Takaichi has to avoid being seen as hawkish, but instead is accepting a necessary evil for Japan. The political machine run by the corporate favorites will do a lot of the heavy lifting to shift the opinions in the background as time continues. But as it stands though, many in Japan believe she has handled this situation quite well. These policies, even if uncomfortable, are still wanted by a large set of people inside the country. The relationship between the corporate supporters and the people can be very much flipped when you approach immigration. Since the 1980s boom, Japan has been in a search for cheap and flexible labor. Much of that can be imported. When deflation hit, companies applied more pressure to increase immigration. This number has now climbed to 4 million foreign residents inside the country. About a quarter are permanent residents, another quarter are students or highly skilled labor here for work, and the last half are either spouses, ethnic Japanese returning to Japan, or low-skilled labor primarily from Muslim-dominant countries. Despite the number of residents increasing, the numbers of foreigners becoming naturalized citizens has decreased. In 2008, it hit its peak of roughly 16,000 people gaining Japanese citizenship. In 2025, that number has fallen to 9,200. Almost in half. Compare that to the 818,000 who became U.S. citizens in 2024, there is a huge difference there. And then take into further consideration that Japan is 97% ethnically homogenous. That is, they're all Japanese. And that is on the low end. On the high end, it's 99%, making it the second most ethnically homogenous country in the world behind North Korea. Migration is just not common, so it's something that is not going to be accepted readily. So when businesses asked for migration to be relaxed in the aftermath of COVID, this was not well received by the people at all. This led to a small Facebook group to form a new right-wing party called Senseido, calling for the removal of all Chinese students, banning foreigners from purchasing land, and denying the voting rights of any naturalized citizen. They have to be birthright and born in Japan to vote. According to their ideas. They had other issues that they campaigned on as well, but immigration was the primary issue for them. And in most of 2025, polling suggested that they would be the third largest party in Japan. Ishiba was open to the idea of more immigration and passed legislation to this effect. However, Takaichi would not have it. Takaichi would make this low-hanging fruit one of her first priorities in power. She would immediately amend immigration laws to effectively ban asylum seekers and refugees from touching Japanese shores, increasing the language requirements to get visa and citizenship in Japan, increasing the naturalization time from 5 to 10 years, and finally increased restrictions on jobs that could be applied for by foreigners. This would be viewed as her biggest policy achievement as of recording. Many people celebrated in Japan, especially the youth and the elderly. However, the same exporters that paid for much of Takaichi's campaign will not have the ability to fill their labor shortages, leaving them with no option but to hire more expensive local workers, causing expansion related to defense spending and other investments to be delayed. The political establishment within the LDP is mostly in favor of these changes, thus giving the corporations no real recourse to fight back against Takaichi without losing support in other key areas, thus kind of proving that this three-way love triangle between all these parties is something that Takaichi is trying to balance. The last key area that we see Takaichi maneuvering in is the economic and inflation department, stating that excessive austerity needed to end instead of promoting crisis management investing, which is something really ridiculous to say after you hear the next stats coming up, because that just does not pan out to reality. Because it needs to be mentioned that Japan has the highest debt to GDP ratio in the world at 254% and has run consistent deficits for over a half a century. All previous predecessors had made large spending increases every year to spur inflation. That has been the consistent for Japan for 40 years. Anyways, she passed a 21.3 trillion yen stimulus package to give 20,000 yen payouts to families per child, energy and housing subsidies to help with cost of living, while investing in semiconductors, shipbuilding, and AI. And then on April 7th of 2026, she passed the largest Japanese budget in history with a 122.3 trillion yen budget, promising 39 trillion yen for pensions, unemployment, and healthcare, subsidies for gas and electric, building again even more semiconductor, shipbuilding, and energy plants that reduce the cost of high school to zero, and school lunches will be mostly covered by the government, as well as a quarter of the budget just going to finance the debt Japan has. And that will also include tax cuts on consumption like food and gas for 2 years. And of course, this will be funded with over 29 trillion yen being issued in new debt. This budget passed without primary opposition support and was fast-tracked on rules that Japan almost never uses. So she is using a huge budget, and there's just a lot of contradiction here that she wants to be able to do this, and so there's just a lot of contradiction here. And these are measures that can help pay for things, but most aren't going to actually target and reduce inflation. There's hope that it is driven by the wars in Iran and Ukraine currently, and that it would disappear after they end. The heavy industry that backs the LDP is happy to see these huge amounts of spending for new plants for them to operate, leading to potentially billions in profits, as well as the people seeing more job opportunities. And there also is the reprieve with subsidies, and there's also the reprieve from rising prices with subsidies, and concentrated investment in domestic industries insulated from supply shocks overseas. However, this all comes at a price tag, something that many within the LDP think is too high. The debt is what propelled the yen downwards and brought wage gains to a halt. When she was elected, Takaichi vowed to tackle fiscal issues within Japan. Takaichi's plan is to expand the growth potential of Japan. But if that growth doesn't materialize, then the only thing remaining is the huge amount of government debt. And that's a problem. Even when passing the new budget, Takaichi was quoted as saying, "Secure the trust of the markets by reducing the government debt to GDP ratio and ending reckless fiscal policy." The budget simply doesn't match up with the quote quite well. The hope is that Japan could grow its economy to shrink its debt to GDP ratio. However, the growth hasn't happened like that in Japan for over 40 years. This spending also alienates many of the fiscal hawks within her party like Taro Aso, the man who literally led the charge in dissolving the different factions within the LDP and uniting them behind Takaichi. He also laid the ground game for the LDP's successful campaign to get her elected with a supermajority. If his voice isn't taken into consideration in the near future for economic issues, while Japan has higher inflation or fails to create more productivity, he may lead a power struggle to remove her. So the casualties of it all. Takaichi has been playing the political game for over 30 years. Few in the world have as much experience as her. The deteriorating situation around the world has forced her to make changes incrementally, bit by slow bit, something hard to notice in democracy. However, she has kept everyone happy enough, delivering on more issues for them than not. This has given her an astoundingly high approval rating after passing laws that many would call political unaliving just a few years ago. The factions are silent, and the victories continue to roll in. She has brushed off scandal after scandal that have sunk her previous predecessors. She is really proving that she is the Iron Woman, the woman who will lead Japan into its next era. We have seen all the policies and how many Japanese citizens are the casualties of this new administration. These policies are all new, and it'll take many months before we see how it affects Japan. I promise to keep you updated as things progress. However, until that time, bye for now.